Hey everyone, how's it going? Taking a look at this problem, either or either filter, which says add code to the function either filter in the place marked add code here. That was right here. I just commented it out. I deleted it. In order to achieve the desired console logs, which we will see down here on line 8. The array returned from either filter should contain all elements in the passed in array that yield a truthy return value when passed into either one of the two callbacks passed into either filter. Okay, so I'm going to comment this back in and let's take a look at what we have. So I really like the meat and potatoes here is line 8. So we are console logging the result of invoking the function either filter. And we have 3 arguments being passed into either filter. So we have an array of nums. Don't even look at this stuff quite yet. We have 3 arguments being passed in. The first is an array of numbers, integer square root, which is going to be one of these callback functions. It's kind of like a checker function. It's going to check some functionality against an element, a value that we pass into it. And then the second callback function is going to be over 100. So bringing these 3 back in, right, we have our array of numbers. It is an array of numbers. We have integer square root, which is a function that takes in a single element. And what it's going to do is it's returning, notice we're using the fat arrow syntax here, so we know that everything on this line is implicitly returned. So we're returning the result of checking. When we call math is a native library in JavaScript that we have access to just by referencing capital M math. So math.sqrt, that's going to check the square root of an element that we pass into it. In this case, whatever that element that we passed into the function was. So it's going to check, is the square root of the element that we passed in. Now we have something here called a modulus operator. So is the square root of the element that we passed in, we say mod 1. In other words, when divided by 1, what is the remainder? When we mod by 1, is the remainder 0? In other words, is the element the number that we passed in when we get the square root of it? Do we find that the square root is a whole number, is a whole integer? And that's going to return either true or false, right? If it passes this test, it will return true. If it does not, it will return false. Now, our second callback function, over 100, is also going to take in a single element, in this case, a number, and it's going to check, is this number greater than 100? If it is, if it passes this check, it will return true. If it does not, it will return false. Okay, so we have defined these 2 functions, our 2 callback functions, and we're passing them in as arguments into our call to either filter. And they're being brought in, right, in our function signature up here, where we actually define like what this function either filter actually does. So it's taking in these 3 arguments as parameters. So our first parameter, we're just calling array. That's going to refer to the array that is coming in. And we're calling these 2 callback 1 and callback 2. These are going to take in those checker functions. So going back to what the prompt is asking us to do, the array returned from either filter. So we know that, right? Big light bulb should be going off there. We know that this function needs to return an array. We also know that by seeing this comment at the end here, right, of line 8, it should log an array containing 105 and 9. So we know one thing already. It needs to return a function. So the array returned from either filter should contain all elements in the passed in array. So we know that we're going to have to somehow look at every single number in the passed in array, probably some sort of loop, that yield a truthy. What does truthy mean, right? Any value that is a true-ish value, right? So explicitly the Boolean true, true. Also, um, numbers greater than or equal to 1 are all truthy. Also, strings, except for empty strings, all strings are truthy, and so on and so forth. Those are truthy values, non-falsy values, right? No undefined, no nulls, all sort of kind of like meaty values, if you will. They'll return true when passed into either one of the two callbacks passed into either filter. So what we are doing, we know that we have to return at some point a new array. So we're going to have to create somehow a new array for our values to be stored in. So we're going to know that we need to somehow create a new array, and eventually at some point we're going to need to return that new array. Okay, so that's kind of our starting point here. Now, what are we doing? Well, we want to check, we want to take in, right? We're taking in this array of numbers. And this array of numbers, we want to check every single number in that array of numbers. And for each number that we're looking at in any given iteration of the loop, right? We're going to need a loop to loop over every number. So in any given iteration of that loop, the number that we're currently looking at needs to return a truthy value when we pass it into either callback 1 or callback 2, which we know are just functions themselves. So let me write down my thoughts here. So we need to loop over the input array, and for each, let's say, number in that array, we want to check, right? For that particular number that we're currently looking at, if we call callback 1 on that number, or callback 2 on that number, and either one returns a truthy value, then we know that that's sort of like a success test case. And we know that we want to keep that particular number that we're looking at. So we know then we want to add that number into our new array, which we're eventually going to return this new array of all the numbers that sort of passed all our test cases, all our checks, right? So we want to push that number into our new array. Otherwise, if it doesn't pass either of those checks, we just want to forget about it. We don't care about that number anymore. Okay, so that's kind of my scaffolding. That's my pseudocoding. So let me actually jump into the code here. So I'm going to say, I'm going to create a new array. I'm going to use the const declaration keyword here. And that's because I'm creating a new sort of, I'm creating sort of the bones of my array, and I'm going to be mutating, I'm going to be changing its inner contents, but I'm not going to be changing the array itself. The array itself is always going to be that same array. So I'm going to say new array is just going to start out as an empty array. I'm going to loop over the input array. That was my parameter up here, array. What type of loop do I want to use? I want to look at every single number a single time, front to back. I know that I'm going to need to hit every single element in it. And then I'm going to, do some sort of unrelated functionality inside of that loop, which doesn't really depend on what that loop itself does, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to use a regular for each loop. I'm going to say for each number in this array. So I'm going to say array. Notice I'm referencing this parameter array up here. Array for each. And for each, right, is a higher order function. It's going to take in a callback function, which is going to run on every single element of the array that we call it on. So we need to scaffold it out something like this. Now, inside of this callback function, which is going to run on each element of our array, we need to define what we want to call the current element that we're looking at. So the current element in any given iteration of this loop, right? Because for each is a loop. So what do we want to call the single element that we're currently looking at? I'm just going to call it num. because we're working with numbers. Okay, so what do we want to do to each num, right? We want to check whether when we pass it into one or the other of the two callback functions, right? Callback one or callback two, if we pass it into either of those functions and it returns true, then we want to keep that number. So I'm going to say if calling callback one on our number, if that returns true, to be sort of more explicit here, we would have to like actually check for various other truthy values. So, numbers greater than or equal to 1, strings that are not empty strings, and so on and so forth. But for now, I'm just going to check against Boolean values. So true or false, explicitly true or false. So if calling callback one on our num returns true, or calling callback two on our num returns true, then I know that I want to keep that particular number. In other words, I want to place it into our new array of values that passed the checks. So I'm going to push it into new array. Okay. Otherwise, if it doesn't satisfy this conditional logic, this if statement, I'm just going to do nothing. I'm going to forget about the current number that we're looking at. Okay. So now the only thing now that I still have to do at the very end, I have to remember to return my new array. And notice how my pseudocoding was indented. I indented every line of pseudocoding which exists inside of a block scope, right? So all of the comments which exist inside of my outer function EitherFilter, all of the comments inside of that, I indented one tab just to kind of like show myself visually, okay, we are inside of one block scope here. And then you can see that, for example, if I had another line of pseudocode that I wanted to exist inside of, let's say, inside of this callback function, this for each loop, I would indent it. See, now this is indented 2 tabs, right? So the indenting of my pseudocode kind of helps me keep on track with where I was in my logic. So I like to make sure that my pseudocode is indented to reflect the block scoping of my actual code. Okay, so this should be it. Let's see. Let's run it. And we have 105 and 9. So looking good there. Any questions? Feel free to hit me up. Let me know. Post a comment or just direct message me. Happy to help out. Oh, by the way, we did set, going back to checking for not just true values, but actually truthy values. So if I wanted to check not against true or false explicitly, but wanted to check truthy values, I could actually remove this conditional, this strict equality check here, and just simply check if running callback one on num produces a value which is truthy, or running callback two on num produces a value which is truthy, then proceed forward with this conditional logic. All right. Thanks for watching. Any questions, let me know.